Hello and welcome back to Franklin Covey's twice weekly podcast on leadership with Scott Miller. That's me. I am your guest twice weekly on Tuesdays and Fridays, where for nearly 7 years I've had the honor of representing Franklin Covey on this podcast as the host while interviewing people from all walks of life: academics, researchers, scientists, best-selling authors, Nobel Prize winners, Fortune 500 CEOs, entrepreneurs, founders, people that have done some research, a lot of research, that have done so to invest in you and make your life as a leader, as a human, as a parent, as a colleague, more effective in allowing you to help pursue and accomplish what is most important to you. Franklin Covey is the sponsor of this podcast, known to millions around the world as the world's most trusted leadership firm, founded in part by the famed academic and author Stephen Covey, who wrote, amongst many books, the consequential tome, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Today's guest is the professor and author of this new book titled Live Forever: A Curious Scientist's Guide to Wellness, Aging, and Death. Joining us today from the UK is Professor John Tregoning. Welcome, Professor, to On Leadership.
Hi, Scott, and thanks for having me on.
Great to have you here. In fact, this is a topic of which we've interviewed a lot of guests because it seems right now there is a healthy interest and obsession in aging, in reversing the aging process if possible, the role that epigenetics plays in our lives, and generally a kind of fixation on health and wellness and longevity. Before we dive into some of the insights that many of us can relate to and are afflicted with or horrified by or trying to prevent a relationship with, we'll talk a little bit about your history. Reintroduce yourself, if you will, to our guests, our listeners and viewers today.
Yeah, so my name's John Tregoning. I'm a professor of vaccine immunology at Imperial College London. I'm a scientist, a researcher. I also write and teach.
John, rarely do I use an author's table of contents as an interview guide. In fact, not all of our guests are authors. But however, yours is so well organized on about 10 areas in which all of us need to have some knowledge. I'm actually going to organize our next 30 minutes of conversation into about 10 topics in order of how you list them in the book, and have you spend about 2 minutes on each of them. Perhaps, why is it so prevalent? Why are people afflicted with it? And what are some tips and points we can do to prevent that? And so we're going to do a bit of a water ski across the following 10 topics. I'll just pitch them so our listeners and viewers can learn. Heart disease, stroke, lung disease, cancer, dementia, diabetes, liver and kidneys, and we'll talk about frailty and maybe getting old as the culmination. You, of course, have great curiosity around these topics and research and credentials around them. Let's talk a little bit about why you wrote this book, and then we'll launch into the number one killer, which is heart disease. Why this topic? Why now?
Yeah, so some of it was because I'm aging and I could no longer deny that process. I was sitting in the barbershop and the hair falling from my head was disappointingly grey. But some of it was, it's just a way to think about the body. And it was like you said, that table of contents didn't come about by accident. We put it in an order of the impact upon human lifespan and well-being.
So we're going to run through about 7 or 8 of these topics that each of us either will face, are facing, have a loved one or a colleague who's facing, and perhaps today we can have a little bit broader information and knowledge around how to prevent this or deal with it as pretty ubiquitous health concerns that any and all of us will face, likely one of these in our lifetime. So we're going to do a bit of a 30-minute speed round. Let's take about maybe 3 to 4 minutes on each of these. I'm going to pitch you the killer or the ailment. I'd like you just to riff on it in terms of things you want us to know, things people might be interested to read in the book should they choose to purchase it. And then are there a couple things you want us to know around how to prevent this or how to minimize it? First is the heart of the matter, you call it, in chapter 4. Killer number 1, heart disease. You say what?
So heart disease is the biggest killer, certainly of men in the UK. It splits into 2 types. There are heart failures and heart attacks. Heart failure is basically where the heart muscle itself stops being able, it reduces its ability to pump blood around your body, and it's a kind of slow decline. Heart attack is where the heart just stops completely and the body stops pretty soon thereafter.
What are the causes that lead to these main heart issues? And then we'll talk about preventative measures.
Yeah, they're pretty common. I mean, and the major one is going to be having blocking of the coronary artery. So that's the blood vessel that feeds the heart. And the major cause of that is too much fat in the blood. If you think about in London, we have occasionally in the London sewers, they have to chip out these enormous fatbergs from the sewers, which is where people have flushed fats down the toilet. And your heart and your blood's a bit like that. If you put too much fat into it, it clogs the vessels, and that will stop your heart working.
And I think everybody probably knows the answer to this, but maybe for the last guest ever, to make it very clear on what we all could do to make that more viscous, to make that less clogged. Your research says, what habits should we be employing?
Yeah, I mean, so this is going to come up in all 10 topics. It is eat better, do exercise, don't smoke, don't drink. And that runs through, that's the kind of the thread through the candy the whole way through.
Does smoking and drinking impact the flow of blood to your heart?
Absolutely. So smoking increases the blood pressure, which puts more stress on the vessels. The toxic mush or stuff you inhale will damage the blood. It will damage the way your system works, and that will put more pressure on the heart. Likewise, alcohol stresses the heart and makes the risk of damage much higher.
I know you're not a nutritionist by education, but you've done an immense amount of research for this book. Are there certain foods, as you have researched them, to say, you know what, cut these out or cut down on them, and it's going to have a less deleterious impact on your heart function?
Yeah, so cut out high fat, high salt, high sugar foods. So the ones, like a candy bar or sugar-coated peanuts or something. Those foods where it's very calorie rich, very sweet, very salty, they're particularly bad for your heart.
So you're saying less cheese sticks, less fried cheese sticks.
Yeah, exactly, within moderation.
Wisconsinites, pay attention. Okay, let's talk about strokes. You're doing this exactly how I hoped you would. Not sure any of us really know the difference between a heart attack, heart disease, and a stroke. First, make that differentiation and talk about why this is so common. Number two killer, if you will.
So stroke is a brain disease, or it's a disease that affects your brain. Your brain needs lots of blood. About 20% of your energy is keeping your brain running, not just thinking and conversations like we're having now, but actually just to keep your heart going, to keep your body running. Those blood vessels, if they burst, your brain stops working and then you die. And there are two ways that a stroke can happen. You can get a clot, which stops the blood getting to the brain, or you can get a blood vessel rupturing, which stops the blood to the brain. Both of them are very, very bad.
I'm horrified right now. As the parent of 3 young boys, I'm sure we all have a ticking time bomb going off in our body. Okay, so to that point, give us some hope, John. What can we do to minimize the risk of stroke?
So the major risk factor for stroke is high blood pressure, and a big driver of high blood pressure is too much salt in your diet. So a simple way to do it is to reduce the salt in the diet. However, as we get older, we may need to treat it medically, and this is where the family of drugs called antihypertensives come in. And if your doctor prescribes them, there's certainly value in taking them, because that will lower your lower your high blood pressure and lower your risk of stroke.
John, if you were holding a focus group of, say, 50, 60-year-olds, you would say a frequent physical of what regularity will help you understand what your risks are, your blood pressure. How often should someone, say they feel like they're in good health, how often should someone be having a general physical so that a doctor could do blood work and do blood pressure tests, just to give you a sense of what needs to be under control?
Yeah, so in the UK, we have, it's prescribed like once every 10 years. And you don't need a big, complicated panel. You need a nice, small, simple one linked to somebody who can prescribe something. And I would recommend blood pressure, blood cholesterol, blood sugar, and weight. And pretty much that will cover your major risk groups, especially if it's then linked to somebody who said, here's a medicine that you could take to reduce those levels or reduce that risk.
I'm guessing most physicians would advocate more than once every 10 years, but minimally those panels as well. A lot of wives are very unhappy with you right now. They would probably think it should be more frequently. Okay, let's talk about lung disease. It's so interesting. You know, maybe I live in a bubble. Wait, I do live in a bubble. It's called Salt Lake City, Utah. But you never see someone smoking. Vaping, sadly, yes. But I mean, you never see someone in the street smoking. When you do, at least I must think, oh, they must be here from some else place, because no one who's educated anymore cares about their family or themselves as smoking a cigarette. Now, I'm sure there's hundreds of millions of people that are still choosing to smoke, but you also hear about people getting lung cancer that never smoked in their life. They never lived with a smoker. Talk about the cause of lung disease, how do we prevent it, and what happens when someone gets it and they have no history of any contact with tobacco products.
Yeah, you're kind of getting a double win in Salt Lake City, because it is also one of the least air polluted places in the entire world. And air pollution is as bad for the lungs as say, smoking. So I'll concentrate on the lung diseases rather than, say, cancer right now. So your lungs are basically like a very fine mesh. And what they're for is that they take oxygen in from the air and release carbon dioxide back into it. So you're doing a constant exchange. But you're also breathing in all sorts of things. You know, every time you're breathing pollen and road air pollution and, you know, dust and dirt. And so if you're working in an area, or like silicosis, for example, if you're working in a mine, you might be breathing in lots of that. Something that irritates your lung repeatedly reduces its ability to do that in critical gas exchange. And that's where the damage and the disease comes from.
So, you know, how do we solve that? I mean, you know, most of the world doesn't have the luxury to move from where they live. I mean, you know, look at the pollution in South America and China and other countries in the world, including the U.S., certain cities, right? The inversion or smog in Salt Lake actually is quite dangerous. We're warned frequently in the wintertime. You know, do masks help? Do lock yourself in your house? What do we do?
It's very, very tricky, and it's larger than individual. It needs state level interventions. It needs planting more trees. It needs better public transport networks. It needs reducing the level of pollution coming from factories and cars. And all of these things can work, and it can be done. In London, in the UK, in 1953, 4,000 people died in one single smog incident. And the air quality has massively improved since then. So it can be done, but it requires intervention of some kind.
Well, don't look to the United States to lead out on that in the next 3.5 years. What do we do? What do we do? I'm guessing the majority of lung disease isn't coming from smoking. Sounds like it's coming from environmental measures. Is it just, you know, welcome to the post-industrial age, and until we all start walking again and not driving, we're going to have this around us? Like, what can we do as individuals to minimize our risk for environmental-driven lung disease?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is really, really tricky. I think we should all be encouraging, you know, voting accordingly. Sorry, that's very political. We should certainly be pushing for cleaner air and cleaner air quality. As an individual, you can reduce risky activities. So the most flippant example is keeping pigeons can damage your lungs because you're breathing in the same sort of rubbish all the time. But having a ventilated house, making sure you've not got black mold on the walls, cleaning your house, keeping an airflow, going outside, going to the countryside, I guess, is the simplest thing. If you can get out of your house, get out of the city and go somewhere green, it will give at least a time for your lungs to refresh a bit.
No pigeon keeping. Check.
No pigeon keeping.
I'm on it. Long walks in the countryside. I'll add that to the list. Let's see. I once lived in Oxfordshire, and there were lots of countrysides there. So maybe it's a return to the UK as my key. Okay, let's talk about number 4, cancer. Lots of types of cancer. It seems like all of us are going to get it if we live long enough. What are the most prominent types of cancer, and are there some habits or some interruption of habits that might be broadly beneficial for us all to reintegrate into our day?
Yeah, so cancer is where our cell, most of our cells do grow and replace themselves, and you need that to repair damage. But when a cell starts growing out of control and then spreads to other tissues and starts invading, that's what cancer is. Common types of cancer include lung cancer, which is mostly driven by smoking, but can be driven by air pollution. But there are other causes, other types of cancer which may have less of an environmental risk and may have more of maybe a genetic risk. And that those are, I guess, more tricky to handle, such as like breast cancer, which is that very high association with the BRCA2 gene.
Are there rising types of cancer you see that people could be aware of and say, hey, you need to be doing this, whether prostate cancer or that glioblastoma in the head? Are there some things we can do maybe to lower our risks of the most increasing types of cancer?
I think it's thinking about it a different way. We are all going to die. And as we get better at preventing heart disease or lung disease, it may be that cancer becomes more common. And what we can do is reduce the kind of shorten the period where it's very debilitating, but we'll never be able to kind of get rid of death. So all of these things, it's a tricky balance that one thing may replace something else.
Well, you're a bit of a killjoy, but I understand. It's kind of the way you did not write about cupcakes and rainbows in the book. It's a sobering book, but I think the knowledge that you're giving us is in the book is actually quite actionable around what the prevalence is, what the likelihood that we're going to face it, and what can we in fact do differently. Brain killer, or killer number 5, you referred to as dementia, something I think everybody is, horrified about because we see it. It's so prevalent, right? You don't see heart attacks as, they're not looking at it, but your experience with dementia with loved ones is just almost crippling. What do you say about this?
Yeah, so dementia is the kind of umbrella term, and within that there's a subset called Alzheimer's disease, which is probably the most common form of dementia. And what it is that the cells in your brain need to connect to one another in order to make you function, to enable you to think. And that connectivity decreases over time such that you cross a threshold where there are so few connections that you're losing both the kind of cognitive function, the ability to speak and interact with people, but also the subconscious thought. So actually, a lot of the reason why people with dementia die is because the brain stops telling the heart to beat. So it's not that you forget to do something, your brain just stops working.
Professor, we've had a lot of neuroscientists and neurologists on this program. I'd love to hear you compliment their advice on, are there things that we can do to decelerate or to forestall the potential onset of this in any types of dementia that so many of us are, have relatives, loved ones that are facing?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start slightly bleak the other way. There's definitely things you can do to accelerate it. I think we have a fairly linear decline in the connectivity in our brain. It's quite slow, but if you have a traumatic blow to the head, that jumps it down much quickly. So avoiding traumatic blows to the head is really important. In terms of improving or slowing the rate of decay, one of the simplest things, actually, which was a really interesting thing that I learned when I was researching it, is people who have age-associated hearing loss, getting hearing aids can then benefit them because they get reconnected, and that actually slows the rate of dementia onset. So if you're beginning to lose your hearing, think about getting hearing aids early. And actually, they're so, my father's recently got them, and they're so clever now that you can connect them to the radio, you can connect them to your phone. They're not the thing that maybe they were like 30 years ago, how we imagined them to be.
Are you finding that the research globally around cures or identifying causes for dementia is happening at the pace that you hope it would, given how pervasive forms of dementia seem to be in our lives?
I'm not surprised at the pace of it. The human body is enormously complicated. I've been one idea that's come to me very recently, or also the sort of mantra I've been saying to myself quite recently is that if you think you understand human biology, you don't. And so if we apply that to the brain, which we don't understand, how can we make cures faster? So no, I'm not surprised, because it's such a complicated thing. The fact that there are any drugs at all is cause for celebration, actually.
Hey, well said. We've done 5 killers. Isn't this a joyful podcast? Heart disease, strokes, lung cancer, lung disease, cancer, and dementia. Let's talk about something that we see on TV, at least here in the Western U.S., all the time, and that is diabetes, in terms of all the drugs and all the Ozempics and things that probably have some relation to that. Talk about anything you'd like to around diabetes.
Yeah, so diabetes is where the body loses its ability to process sugar and to trap sugar away. So if I was to have a candy bar now, my blood sugar should spike and then it should decline again. And if it doesn't decline again, it changes the pressure in your peripheral blood vessels. So it puts too much pressure and it causes damage to the eyes and to the toes. It can cause increased blood pressure and heart attacks and strokes. So too much sugar in your blood is bad for you, and diabetes is where you can't control the sugar in your blood.
Is most diabetes a cause of people's eating habits, overeating too much sugar? Some of it's hereditary. Talk about the different types of diabetes and how you forestall those from coming on.
Yeah, so there's type 1 diabetes, which is where it's kind of an acute failure, and much of people living with that, it's often not caused by dietary, it's just a genetic environmental thing that cannot be controlled. Type 2 diabetes is the one that is more associated with diet. And this is where, over time, people living with obesity or people living with kind of very poor sugar-rich diets, their body kind of basically loses the ability to process it. The type 2 diabetes is more controllable and reversible. And this is where drugs like Ozempic are making a huge difference. So people living with type 2, with like pre-diabetes and living with obesity, going onto Ozempic will very much reduce their risk of getting diabetes.
Professor, I don't eat a lot of sugar. I mean, like, I don't go to the convenience store and eat a lot of candy, don't put a lot of sugar in my drinks, don't eat a lot of high sugary foods, at least at face value. But I think one of my issues is I eat a lot of things that turn into sugar, right? Whether it is, white flours or carbs, things like that. Talk a little bit about some of the things we are consuming that are turning into sugar, that if we just had a better awareness of what happens in our body, we could also, mediate those.
So everything turns into sugar. So brown food, high GI index, it all becomes sugar, because sugar is the energy unit of the body. It's how your body runs. The much more important thing is balancing calorie intake with calorie output. If they're roughly the same, then there shouldn't be a problem. If you've got way more calories in than calories out, that's where you're leading to the risk of you'll get obesity and then increasing the risk of many of the diseases we've talked about already.
So, simply you're saying it's fine to have a piece of bread, just make sure you're on the treadmill for 20 minutes to burn that off.
Yeah, exactly. So balance, everything in moderation is the simple but actually right message.
Yeah, beautifully said. Okay, let's go on to more killers. Killers 7 and 8. Liver and kidneys, take that where we need to go.
Yeah, so the major cause of liver failure is drinking too much alcohol. And this is the one that I found the hardest message to process. So, alcohol is quite a social lubricant in the UK. It is at celebrations and it's at commiserations, and it's quite central to everything we do. And this awareness that we need to have is that it is a poison, but we're making a choice to imbibe it, and a bit more around the kind of thinking about what it's doing to us, at least when we drink it, and at least making an informed choice is really important.
So, you hear, for the last 30 years, the lobbyists, the alcohol industry, their opponents have said, well, a glass of wine a day is great, or look at the French, and then it swings this way, then it swings that way. It seems like as of late, there's a large, at least on social media, there seems to be a large push around sobriety, or at least abstention or alternative non-alcoholic drinks, and people really moving away from alcohol in major droves because it seems like as of late, there's no evidence to say any amount of alcohol is good for your body. Would you, again, not a physician in terms of, prescribing for us, but certainly a scientist and professor, if you had to say someone, if you're going to consume alcohol, keep it at this level, and this level is not going to have a measurable negative impact on your life, or would you simply say, no, everybody needs to take this as serious as, some other drug or negative substance? What would you say about this generally?
So there is no safe level. There is a suggestion at a population level that maybe 1 drink a day is slightly more protective than none drinks a day. But the none drinks a day group in that one may have also included people who were ex-alcoholics or have other issues. So the controls weren't that good. I think the kind of simple advice is that no alcohol is probably better than any alcohol. There's no safe number. The less, if you're going to drink, the less the better. So it's kind of 1 drink is better than 2, is much better than 3, is almost infinitely better than 4 drinks a day. So keeping it down at the lower end is the advice, but it is being mindful that it is, it does provide enjoyment. It provides connectivity, and that's really important as well. So if you completely get rid of it and it's been part of your life in the way you interact with friends, it may be that you're actually losing more than you're gaining. So it's one of these areas where we need to be thinking about risk in the whole rather than one specific item.
Yeah, well said. Were there some insights that you uncovered or wrote about in Live Forever that really just surprised you? They rocked the way in which you'd conducted your research or had lived your life. Share some of the maybe serendipitous surprises for us.
So I think as it's maybe come across, it did sound a bit bleak, like the whole thing about talking about death and dying and each organ failing, but I got towards the end, and one of the things I discovered or researched and learnt about was that social connectivity is the other thing that we can do easily and cheaply to improve both the quantity and the quality of our lives. And that was the really most important take home I found from the whole book.
Your book is titled Live Forever, A Curious Scientist's Guide to Wellness, Aging, and Death. Professor John Tregoning, thanks for your time today. I think anybody who is interested in, if not just extending their life, but increasing the quality of your life physically, emotionally, mentally, fantastic read, written maybe easier than you think it might have been, very engaging in terms of your stories, your research, and a lot of great ideas on how to modify our behaviors. Professor, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate you.
Thank you very much for having me on.
And we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.